What if some of the strangest things in medieval life, the cures, the customs, the structures, were never meant to last, yet somehow survived you by centuries? Tonight, you slip into a world where the temporary refuses to disappear, lingering like a stubborn shadow in torchlight. And from here, your journey only gets deeper. Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world where the things meant to disappear, the scraps, the charms, the improvised shelters, the little temporary fixes, somehow refuse to fade. You stand in the middle of a medieval town square, and everything around you feels a little unstable, a little improvised, like someone tried to patch life together with twine and good intentions. And yet, despite the rattling wind and the soft groan of timber, you realize these things have survived longer than the people who made them. It's one of those moments where you quietly think, yeah, you probably wouldn't survive this, but you can't help leaning in all the same. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening right now, let me know your location and the current time down below. I always love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take a slow breath as the lamps of the medieval town flicker at the edges of your vision. Cobblestone streets wind and twist, as if the builders ran out of planning halfway through and decided to let the path figure itself out. You step forward, feeling the uneven stones under your feet, and you notice something strange. Nothing here looks truly permanent. A wooden stall patched together with rope and prayer leans against a stone wall as though it's been temporarily fixed for the last 150 years. A scribbled note is pinned to the market post, the ink faded yet somehow still legible. You glance closer. It's a notice about bread taxes that will be adjusted next week. Historians still argue whether that particular next week ever actually happened. You wander toward a row of houses where the timber frames bow slightly outward, as if trying to escape their own foundations. One old man sweeping his doorstep sees your puzzled expression and laughs softly, telling you, "Don't worry, it's only meant to be temporary," which is, frankly, not very comforting. You nod anyway and keep walking, partly because you don't have the courage to ask what exactly he means by temporary. In this world, that could mean anything from 5 minutes to 5 centuries. A faint smell of tallow, wet wool, and something you suspect is yesterday's stew hangs in the air. Kids chase each other between awnings stitched with mismatched cloth scraps. Cloth that was supposed to be reused for bandages, or bags, or something useful later. But here it is, fluttering in the wind like a row of medieval prayer flags. You can't help smiling at the patchwork chaos of it, though you make a mental note not to stand under anything attached with only one nail, just in case. This street, you realize, is built on layers of improvisation. A wall repaired with a spare door, a fence held upright by an extra wheel, a stall roof covered with shingles that look suspiciously like old shield scraps. And in the middle of it all, a woman selling charms carved into slivers of bone. Tiny little temporary protection tokens. They were supposed to be used only once. Yet she tells you families keep them for decades, tucked inside drawers or sewn into pockets. They just feel safer, she says with a shrug. Funny how temporary things cling to people long after the original purpose evaporates. You pick up one charm shaped like a small spiral. She explains it was meant to be tossed into a river after a long journey to ensure safe travels home. But people keep 'em now, she adds, sipping from a cup of something steaming. Hard to let go of what helped you once. That's your first quirky tidbit of the night, and it lands gently in your mind, like an afterthought with more weight than expected. Your path brings you toward an improvised shelter built from planks salvaged from who knows where. Rain has darkened the wood to a deep, melancholy brown. The structure creaks every time the breeze nudges it, like an old man sighing. At first, you assume it's abandoned, just another project left half-finished during a season of storms. But then you see a candle flicker inside. Someone lives there. Someone has lived there for years. That's the kind of medieval logic you've stepped into. Build a temporary hut for a week-long stay, then accidentally raise 3 generations inside it. Happens to the best of us. A young apprentice passing by with an armful of firewood explains that this shelter was originally put together for an unexpected flood season. Thought it'd be taken down once the river calmed, he says. But the river never quite behaved after that, so, you know. He gives a sheepish grin as if medieval civilization itself is an elaborate, just until things settle down situation. You continue down the street, noticing small scratches on the walls. Marks people carved to record dates, tallies, or blessings. You run your fingers over one particular inscription, for protection until the next full moon. The edges are rubbed smooth, worn by countless brushing hands. The next full moon came and went several hundred years ago, but the blessing is still there, clinging to the stone. You imagine the original carver whispering the words quickly, expecting them to fade like a breath. Instead, the breath became a ghost that lingers. Modern asides slip into your mind. You think about how your own temporary decisions, saving an old email, keeping a cardboard box, just in case, slowly accumulate until they become permanent features of your life. You chuckle quietly. At least you're not carving protective runes into your walls. Yet, a horse trots by, dragging a cart patched together with 3 different carpenter's souls. One will squeaks relentlessly, like it's filing a complaint each time it rotates. The driver pats it affectionately and says, "Meant to replace that ages ago." You don't doubt him. You also don't believe him. This will has been complaining since before he was born. The mainstream historical fact slips naturally into place as you continue walking. Many medieval towns truly were built on makeshift solutions that became permanent without anyone planning it. Market rules, street layouts, even the placement of wells were often temporary decisions made during emergencies, fires, floods, or outbreaks, that solidified simply because no one bothered to undo them. The town grew around its own accidents. As dusk deepens, lanterns swing from hooks that were supposed to be used only during special feast days. A cat perches beneath one, eyeing you with the judgment of all medieval cats, which seems to be their natural resting expression. The lantern's light spills in a warm cone across the street, and you realize it's held up by a rusty hinge tied with a thin piece of rope. The hinge was originally part of a broken door. The rope was supposed to be cut for a horse bridle, but now, together, they illuminate half the neighborhood. A temporary solution glowing permanently in the night. You step back, take in the ramshackle beauty of it all, and notice something almost poetic. Medieval life wasn't built on grand plans. It was made of moments, of small choices, of fixes meant to last just long enough. And somehow, against all logic, those tiny choices end up shaping centuries. You turn another corner, and the maze of temporary life stretches ahead. It feels familiar now, like you're walking through the forgotten leftovers of time, where the things meant to disappear are the ones that stayed. You move deeper into the medieval town, and the air shifts from the warm, smoky scent of hearth fires to something sharper. Herbs crushed underfoot, resin, a hint of vinegar, and something you really hope isn't animal fat but absolutely is. This is the neighborhood of healers, apothecaries, and midwives, where nearly everything was meant to be temporary. Remedies, salves, brews, poultices, they were quick fixes, improvised answers to immediate problems. Yet, as you drift farther in, you realize many of these stopgap concoctions didn't disappear at all. They hardened, fossilized, and wormed their way into the backbone of medieval medicine. Someone calls out to you from a small wooden booth. A woman with sharp eyes, smudged sleeves, and a basket overflowing with dried plants gestures for you to come closer. Her hands move fast, sorting leaves the color of old parchment. "Temporary cures," she says with a tight smile, "meant to hold you over until something better comes along." You lean in and she adds, "Not that anything better ever did." In her fingers, she holds a wad of moss, soft, greenish, and slightly damp. She presses it into your palm. "Wound packing," she explains. "Sphagnum moss, a temporary battlefield solution used because it absorbed blood quickly. But medieval soldiers started relying on it so heavily that it stuck around for generations. The quirky part? It actually worked better than many official medical treatments of the time. Rich in natural antiseptic qualities, it saved more lives than most fancy apothecary mixtures. Historians still argue whether it became popular by accident or because someone realized how effective it was and quietly claimed it was blessed by forest spirits. Honestly, both sound equally plausible in this setting. You hand the moss back, partly fascinated, partly relieved she doesn't expect you to test it personally. She moves on to another item, a jar of leeches. Of course there are leeches. Medieval medicine loved a good leech as long as it was temporary. Just a quick balancing of the humors, they'd say, as if that made attaching a squirming bloodsucker to your arm sound any less horrifying. But the temporary ritual became an institution. Bleeding, done by leeches, knives, or cups, became so standard that it lasted well into early modern medicine. You shudder lightly, making a small joke in your head about how at least you didn't have to fill out insurance paperwork for it. Nearby, an apprentice pestles something in a mortar, the rhythmic grinding echoing through the narrow alley. You watch as he adds a dollop of honey, a pinch of ash, and something that looks like crushed petals. He glances up with a sheepish shrug. Cough remedy, he says, works best if you don't actually taste it. Another stopgap mixture, meant to soothe the throat for a single night. But people grew to love the blend so much that some families passed their own versions down for centuries. Tiny little heirlooms of improvisation. You step back to avoid a cat weaving between your legs, clearly on a mission to reach a basket full of dried fish guts. The cat gives you a glare anyway because that's how medieval cats operate, as if they're the true healers of the town and you're simply in the way. A healer calls out to shoo the cat, but not too loudly. We need them, she mutters, for rats. Another temporary solution that stuck around so hard it shaped entire urban ecosystems. A soft breeze carries the scent of lavender and rosemary toward you, and you follow it to a small stone cottage where a midwife tends to her tools. She sits on a low stool, stirring a bowl of warm water into which she drops handfuls of herbs. Pain relief for childbirth, she says, not looking up, just enough to take the edge off. The mixture was never intended to transform medicine, just to help one woman through one night. Yet midwives refined and passed down these herbal tricks, generation by generation, until they became foundational elements of medieval domestic healing. Some of the herbs, like lavender for calming, chamomile for nausea, are still used today. You realize that temporary ideas often survive when they actually work. Inside her cottage, strings of herbs hang from the ceiling like overgrown wind chimes. Some are medicinal, some are spiritual, some are just precautions because, well, medieval logic. A bundle of wormwood swings gently near your head. A charm against fevers, she says. Not meant to stay up long, she adds. But once you've seen a fever burn through a family, you don't take it down. A little shiver runs down your spine. Not fear, exactly, just a quiet respect for the desperation woven into each of these temporary protections. A man with soot-stained fingers hurries past carrying a boiling pot. Salve-making day, he grunts. You peer inside the pot as he passes and instantly regret it. The mixture looks like melted tar with chunks floating in it. You ask what it's for. To draw out fire from burns, he says. You blink. Fire? A temporary measure, he adds casually. Until the body remembers itself. You nod, though your brain is politely screaming. Another quirky tidbit. Medieval burn treatments often involved sticky, tar-like pastes intended to pull out heat. It didn't always work, but it did create an entire subculture of salve makers who passed their recipes down with surprising pride. You turn a corner and enter what looks like a small open-air clinic. Wooden benches line the edges, and the smell here is intense. Someone is boiling vinegar, someone else grinding garlic, and a third person is waving a feather fan over a patient who looks simply exhausted by the entire ordeal. The healer explains this was originally a temporary sick house, a setup meant for an outbreak season, but it became a permanent fixture. Too much sickness to ever take it down, she says with a shrug. People need help year-round. She says it with a heavy warmth. You can feel the compassionate exhaustion of someone who never stops tending, never stops patching, never stops helping. The mainstream historical fact settles in your thoughts again. Medieval medicine was a strange blend of real effectiveness and astonishing guesswork. Many treatments were devised out of urgency: plague, famine, war, and became tradition simply because no better alternative arose. The entire framework of humoral theory, for example, persisted not because it explained everything, but because it explained enough for people to cling to it. You drift past a table of small clay pots, each labeled with a charcoal mark. One healer opens a pot, revealing a cream-colored paste. Temporary ointment for swelling, he says brightly. Helps for a week or so. You ask what happens after a week. He hesitates. We make more ointment. Logical enough in its own loop-around way. You can't help but smile at the earnestness of it all. These healers are improvising with whatever they have. Honey, herbs, water, heat, hope. And somehow these improvisations last centuries. Today you'd call it a temporary fix. Back then it was survival. And when survival works, people remember it. You take one last look at the herbal-laced courtyard before stepping back into the street. The jars, the moss, the charms, the poultices. They feel like tiny, fragile moments meant to fade after a season. But instead, they linger woven into memory, ritual, and eventually history. You carry the scent of rosemary with you as you walk away, like a reminder that the simplest remedies often leave the deepest marks. You follow the winding street out of the healer's quarter, and as the mingled scents of herbs, vinegar, and questionable poultices fade, something brighter drifts toward you. Smoke from torches, distant laughter, the soft clatter of wooden rattles. You aren't heading into another market or square. You're stepping straight into a medieval celebration, the kind that was meant to last only a day or two before dissolving back into the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. But here, as the light spills across the cobblestones and people gather with an almost instinctive joy, you sense that some of these fleeting festivities never really ended. A group of villagers pass by wearing garlands of leaves and bits of ribbon, their clothes slightly mismatched, as if everyone grabbed whatever fabric scraps were left from the winter mending pile. A woman presses a sprig of something fragrant behind your ear. It smells like fresh mint and a little bit like dirt. Festival blessing, she says softly. Just for tonight. She gives you a knowing smile, the kind that says tonight has been recreated every year since before her grandmother was born. The festival around you feels stitched together from dozens of borrowed traditions. Temporary customs, created for a single season, a single crisis, or a single royal announcement, somehow became yearly rituals. Historians still argue whether medieval communities did this out of love for celebration or because life was tough enough that any excuse for merriment was grabbed and held tightly. And you can't blame them. If your daily life involved leeches, unpredictable harvests, and roads that seemed allergic to straight lines, you'd probably cling to a good party too. You step aside as two teenagers run past wearing masks carved from bark. Simple, crude things that look more adorable than alarming. A hawker tells you they're performing a fright for good luck act, a temporary tradition that started during a particularly rough harvest season when villagers thought scaring away spirits might encourage the crops to grow. Apparently it worked once, maybe twice, or maybe the weather simply behaved. Either way, the bark masks remained, because medieval superstition has the emotional persistence of a cat demanding breakfast at 4 a.m. At the center of the square, a tall wooden pole wrapped in vines stands planted firmly in the earth. It was originally erected for a single midsummer celebration, the kind of joyous relief after a long winter that people needed like bread and warmth. But no one ever bothered to take it down. Over the years, more ribbons were tied, more vines twined themselves around the wood, and it slowly transformed from a temporary decoration into a permanent part of the town's identity. A young man plucks at a lute nearby, strumming a lively tune that makes your foot tap involuntarily. It's been here longer than half my family line, he says, nodding at the pole. Would feel wrong without it. You drift toward a table where women are kneading dough into small, round cakes. Their hands move quickly, efficiently, the way people work when they've done the same task every year since childhood. One hands you a cake fresh from the fire pit, still steaming. She explains it's a blessing cake, originally baked only once, during a moment of communal fear after an illness swept through the region. Just a one-time treat to raise spirits. But people felt comforted, and so the cake became tradition. You take a bite. It tastes earthy, a little sweet, and extremely comforting. the medieval equivalent of emotional support carbs. A group of musicians begins playing at the far end of the square, and villagers gather to dance in a loose circle. The steps are simple: right foot, left foot, turn, clap, laugh. They invite you to join, and you do, partly out of politeness and partly because the rhythm is contagious. As you move with the crowd, the cobblestones shift unevenly under your feet, and someone accidentally bumps your shoulder, but no one seems to mind. It feels like you've slipped into a tradition that began as a temporary gathering to celebrate the end of a drought or a victory in a skirmish and somehow stuck around because it made people feel connected. There's something touching about it. Something beautifully human. A baker leaning against his stall tells you about the Feast of Lanterns, a festival that began because one overly ambitious lord wanted to impress visiting nobles by lighting the entire town for one night. He ordered lanterns hung from every archway and doorway, meant to be removed the next morning. But villagers loved the glow so much they brought the lanterns back the following year, and the next, until the lord's one-night showmanship unwittingly created a centuries-old tradition. You imagine the poor man waking up, seeing half his servants rehanging lanterns, and realizing he accidentally invented a permanent holiday. Nearby, a child tugs at your sleeve and points toward a group performing a small puppet show. The puppets are made from cloth scraps and carved sticks, temporary toys, meant to entertain children while parents worked. But someone enjoyed the act enough to refine it, then pass it on, then expand it into a rotating set of miniature stories. You watch for a moment as the puppets reenact the tale of a wandering farm animal who outsmarts a greedy miller. You laugh softly, not only because the story is charming, but because one puppet clearly has its face drawn upside down. The children love it. Comedy is timeless, apparently. You slip away toward the bonfire at the edge of the square. A man stands there warming his hands and tells you that bonfires like this were originally part of a temporary ritual meant to ward off wolves one night during a harsh winter. People gathered around the flames to sing, to open a circle of light that kept the dark at bay. The wolves left eventually, but the bonfire stayed, year after year, an anchor of warmth in uncertain times. The mainstream historical fact settles into view. Medieval festivals often blended pagan, Christian, local, and seasonal influences in ways that created incredibly durable traditions. Some celebrations that began as improvised responses to weather disasters or political changes ended up forming the backbone of entire cultural calendars. Temporary customs became permanent because they carried emotional meaning, hope, relief, togetherness. You spot a small shrine tucked near an oak tree at the edge of the square. At first, it looks like a makeshift memorial, just a handful of candles, a few ribbons, a carved wooden charm. But an older woman tells you it started as a temporary thank offering for a safe childbirth. One family set it up just for the night. Then neighbors added their own little tokens. Then visitors left prayers. Now it's a quiet, enduring corner of the festival grounds, maintained without anyone being officially in charge of it. A communal memory woven from hundreds of tiny acts. A soft breeze rustles the leaves overhead as you take one last slow walk through the square. Laughter still rings in the air. The smell of warm bread lingers, and strings of ribbons flutter like soft, colorful whispers. You realize that medieval life, hard as it often was, held tightly onto joy whenever it appeared. And anything that brought even a spark of joy, even once, had a way of becoming tradition. You leave the square with one of the festival ribbons tucked lightly into your sleeve. A tiny, temporary keepsake that might just linger longer than you expect. You leave the fading laughter and lantern glow of the festival behind, stepping onto a quieter road that slopes gently downward toward the outskirts of town. The air cools, the noise thins, and suddenly you're surrounded not by people or music, but by buildings. Structures that clearly weren't meant to last. You can tell instantly. Their beams are rough-hewn, their joints hasty, their roofs sagging slightly under years of rain. Yet despite their temporary beginnings, they stand there stubbornly, as if medieval time itself forgot to knock them down. You approach the first of these buildings, a storage shed leaning at a degree that would make a modern building inspector pass out on the spot. It was originally built during a sudden grain surplus decades ago, a moment when the harvest was unexpectedly generous and the village needed emergency storage. The intention was simple. Throw something together for a season, just long enough to keep the rats out. But the season turned into years, the years turned into habit. And now the shed is tied so tightly into local memory that tearing it down feels unthinkable. The planks creak as you brush your fingers along them, and a small joke pops into your head. That in medieval times, even buildings had commitment issues, except the temporary ones. Those stuck around forever. A carpenter waves at you from a nearby workshop. He's sharpening a chisel with a rhythm that suggests he's been doing it for decades. That shed? He nods. My grandfather built it, said it'd be gone in a year, thought it was too ugly to last. He gives you a shrug that says medieval architecture didn't always care about elegance. Guess everyone got attached to it. He points out that temporary structures were often built from whatever wood was available. Sometimes green, sometimes warped, sometimes scavenged from older buildings. Yet many survived simply because people reinforced them bit by bit over time, never fully rebuilding, just patching, mending, and hoping for the best. Historians still argue whether medieval communities were masters of resourcefulness or simply reluctant to let go of anything that still technically stood upright. You continue along the lane and find yourself facing a long, low hall with mismatched stones stacked along the walls. A farmer carries a basket of tools inside and explains that this was once a provisional meeting house, built during a local dispute that required temporary gatherings for mediation. Once the conflict was resolved, the building should have been dismantled. Instead, villagers repurposed it for weddings, feasts, winter gatherings, tax announcements, and even the occasional impromptu play performed by traveling actors. You peek inside and see smoke stains on the rafters, carvings etched by bored teenagers on the benches, and bundles of dried flowers left over from some long-forgotten ceremony. A soft breeze carries a faint musty scent, and as you step back, you realize the building feels alive with layers of memory. It makes you think of a quirky detail. Many medieval structures, even temporary ones, were designed with joinery that allowed parts to be disassembled easily. Yet the irony is that the parts simply never went anywhere. The convenience became the downfall of temporary. A few steps later, you come across what looks like a hut barely clinging to life. Wattle and daub walls patched so many times the pattern looks like mismatched quilt squares. A woman sweeping the threshold tells you it was originally built for seasonal workers who came during harvest time. A lodging meant for a few months at most. But when one of the workers stayed through winter, then the following spring, families began settling nearby. Before long, a mini neighborhood sprouted around a house that was essentially medieval cardboard. And now, it's home. You duck your head inside and spot bundles of herbs, a patched wool blanket, a small wooden stool, and a pot simmering with something that smells like onions and hope. Temporary shelter turned beloved hearth. Another quiet magic of medieval living. You step back into the light, and your eyes catch something even more surprising. A watchtower. Or, at least it used to be. Built quickly during a period of border tension, it was supposed to stand for a single season of heightened alerts. Now it leans slightly, its roof repaired with mismatched tiles, its edges softened by moss. A young boy climbs the lower stones with the ease of someone who's done it every day of his life. Good view, he yells down to you. You can see the goats from here. So much for military vigilance. This once temporary defensive structure has become the village's unofficial goat monitoring station. You look up and imagine those tense early days. Guards squinting into the distance, hand on sword hilt, torches burning through long nights. That urgency is gone now, replaced by tranquility. But the tower remains, an accidental monument to a moment of fear that turned into everyday usefulness. A mason approaches, wiping dust from his beard. He tells you that in medieval times, temporary scaffolding or wooden frameworks sometimes stayed up long after the project they supported was completed, partly because dismantling them required labor, and partly because they were immediately reused for the next project. Over time, some became semi-permanent features of the town itself. One of the weirdest tidbits he shares is that there are records of scaffolding actually becoming living spaces, with people hanging cloth over the beams and moving in temporarily, then refusing to leave. You glance at the leaning structures around you and think, yes, that checks out. Medieval life was full of unofficial construction upgrades. As you walk farther, you reach the remnants of what used to be a temporary market shelter. The timbers are half-rotted, the roof patched with 3 different materials, but vendors still gather here once a week. A fishmonger grins at you and holds up a particularly unenthusiastic-looking trout. This place survived cold winters, wet summers, and 6 arguments between rival bakers, he says proudly. He explains the shelter was built during a sudden surge in trade, placed quickly to protect vendors from rain. People loved having shade, so the structure stayed, and stayed, and stayed, evolving with the marketplace like a stubborn old friend who refuses to retire. The mainstream historical fact becomes clear as you glance around. Many medieval buildings were constructed with the assumption they'd be temporary, but because wood was precious and tearing things down required time, effort, and community agreement, the structures simply lingered. They became part of the local landscape. This accidental permanence shaped entire villages. You turn toward the path leading out of the settlement and notice a small bridge spanning a narrow stream. At first glance, it seems sturdy, but as you walk across, you feel its age in the uneven planks and slight sway. A shepherd leaning on the railing tells you it was built quickly after heavy rains washed away the old crossing. Villagers replaced it with whatever they could find. Scrap wood, leftover beams, even pieces of broken carts. It was supposed to last until the real bridge could be built. That was 70 years ago. You bite back a laugh, imagining the medieval town meeting where someone surely said, "We'll fix it next summer," and then absolutely never did. As you step off the bridge, the shepherd adds softly, "Sometimes the things we make in urgency stay with us the longest." You feel the weight of that sentiment. Temporary buildings aren't just patched planks and crooked beams. They're stories, memories, markers of lives lived quickly and repaired slowly. You walk on, leaving the makeshift structures behind you, carrying with you the realization that in medieval life, nothing was ever as temporary as intended. Not buildings, not traditions, not even the hurried solutions created in moments of pressure. Everything had the potential to cling to existence just a little longer, and sometimes a lot longer. You continue your quiet walk through the medieval town long after the market noise has softened to a distant hum. The night is deepening now, stretching itself lazily across the rooftops and chimneys, settling into the alleys like a great velvet cloth. Torches flicker against doorways, casting slow golden pulses on the ground. Small islands of light in a sea of blue darkness. It is in this quiet hour that you begin to notice something else entirely. Rules. Written rules, spoken rules, unwritten rules. And many of them, strangely enough, linger like stubborn ghosts. What fascinates you most is that many of these medieval rules were never meant to be permanent. They were supposed to last only for a moment, just long enough to address a crisis or a passing problem. Yet here, in the glow of torchlight, you can feel how these temporary measures cling on, weaving themselves into the social fabric like ivy sinking roots into old stone. Your first encounter with such a law happens just outside the town granary. A heavy wooden sign hangs crookedly over the entrance, its paint chipped and faded. Someone, centuries ago, carved a regulation into its surface. No person shall store more than 3 sacks of wheat without the reeve's approval. At first glance, it seems like an ordinary medieval rule, restrictive, practical, perhaps overly cautious. But as you run your fingers lightly along the carved letters, you sense something peculiar in its history. This law, a local villager tells you in a hushed tone, was originally created during a famine. It was meant to prevent hoarding for a single winter, a single moment of desperation. When the famine ended, the villagers expected the rule to be lifted, but it never was. Instead, it calcified into everyday governance, shaping the grain economy for generations. You walk past the granary and continue down a narrow lane dotted with soot-stained chimneys and shuttered windows. The cool night air carries faint scents of moss, damp wood, and the embers of cooking fires. Ahead of you, a modest guild hall stands at the edge of the square. Its doorway is flanked by 2 stone pillars, and on one of them, faintly illuminated by a wavering torch, is another law. This one declares that all metalworkers must cease work at dusk. First, this seems odd. Why restrict productivity in a world built upon manual labor? But the explanation arrives quietly from a passing apprentice, his voice soft but eager. Long ago, he tells you, a blacksmith accidentally caused a fire while working late into the night. The flames consumed half a street. In panic, the town council declared a temporary curfew for metalwork, a one-time emergency decree meant to last only until the damaged homes were rebuilt. But rebuilding takes time. And by the time the last beam of the last house was restored, the rule had become so normal, so woven into daily life, that no one thought to dissolve it. Metalworkers, he explains with a tired sigh, still pack up their forges at sundown, even though no one remembers the fire. The law survived, not because of practicality, but because of quiet inertia. You leave the guild hall behind and wander deeper into the town, your steps soft against the cobblestones. A dog barks somewhere in the distance. A church bell tolls softly, marking the hour without urgency. And here, in this calm corner of medieval life, you stumble upon yet another relic of temporary authority. At the bend of the street stands a wooden platform built into the village well. On its post is a notice, written in firm yet elegant script. During times of sickness, each household shall send only one person to draw water. You pause, absorbing the weight of that sentence. Feels heavy even now. A law born out of fear, crafted during a time when illness moved invisibly through crowded spaces. The restriction was meant solely for the duration of a plague season, a short-term measure to limit gatherings at the well. But again, something happened, something very medieval and very human. People grew used to the quiet order the rule created. The well became less crowded. Arguments over line-cutting vanished. Water collection became a nightly ritual of patience and solitude. When the sickness finally passed, no one demanded the rule's removal. It had, like so many temporary laws, slipped silently into permanence. You continue onward, the street narrowing until you reach the courtyard of the local manor. A dim lantern hangs near the gate, swaying gently in the night breeze. Here, carved into a wooden beam, is one more rule, a peculiar one. Strangers lodging within the town must sleep with shutters open for the watchman's inspection. This law, you learn from a sleepy guard leaning on his halberd, was introduced during a brief period of heightened bandit activity on the nearby roads. The measure was meant only for the dangerous months of summer, when travelers arrived in greater numbers and crime spiked. The manor lord at the time insisted on open shutters for quick verification of guests' identities and intentions. But crime died down. The bandits were driven off or found somewhere else to trouble. Travelers became fewer, and yet the rule persisted. Not because it was enforced with passion. Most guards barely remembered why it existed, but because no one bothered to erase it from the manor's expectations. A temporary safety policy that had, over time, become part of the town's quiet rhythm. As you reflect on all these lingering rules, you begin to see a pattern forming like frost on glass. Medieval life was filled with improvisations, reactions, and crisis-born decisions. Few communities had the stability or resources to craft perfect legal codes. Instead, they patched problems with quick, temporary solutions. But once those solutions were in place, once they had taken root in the community's habits and expectations, they became surprisingly difficult to remove. Tradition has a way of sinking its claws in. And in a world where change was frightening and uncertainty was the norm, people often preferred to keep old rules rather than risk something new. You sit on a stone bench near the town square, letting the night settle quietly around you. A soft wind curls around the eaves of nearby houses. A candle burns steadily in a window above you, casting trembling light onto the street. And you realize that these stubborn, long-lingering medieval laws tell a story, not of governance or authority, but of fear, memory, and the human desire for stability. Temporary laws survived because people needed them to. Even after the immediate need faded, the comfort of familiarity stayed. And so these rules, carved in wood, whispered by townsfolk, etched into guild stones, lived on long after their reasons were forgotten. The night deepens, the town sleeps, and you rise from the bench, ready to follow the next thread of this quiet tapestry of medieval life, the gentle evolution of fleeting fears into lasting beliefs. You continue down the quiet street, letting the darkness guide you as it thickens around the edges of the medieval town. A faint mist has begun to rise from the ground, curling softly around the corners of buildings and drifting between the cobblestones like pale breath. The moon hangs low, swollen and milky, scattering a gentle halo across the rooftops. It is in this hazy, dreamlike moment that you begin to sense something else. Something faint, but deeply woven into the atmosphere of medieval life. It is fear, not a loud fear, not the kind that bursts into panic or screams, but a subtle undercurrent of caution that clings to everything. A fear that began long ago as a fleeting worry, a momentary alarm, but slowly hardened into a norm. And like all norms, it became so natural that most people here no longer question it. You notice the first example of this as you pass a modest stone house with a sharply angled thatched roof. Hanging from the doorway is a small bundle of dried herbs, sage, lavender, and something darker you can't identify. It sways gently in the breeze, producing a faint, earthy fragrance. To the medieval townsfolk, this isn't decoration. Once, these herbs were hung during a single season of sickness, believed to purify the air and ward off evil influences. Housewives tied them up in haste during a particularly bad outbreak, convinced by rumor and fear that foul vapors were approaching. The disease eventually passed, but the herbs stayed. The custom lingered like an echo that refused to fade. The bundles became a normal household sight, replaced each year with quiet diligence. Few truly believe the herbs protect them any longer, yet everyone continues the ritual. To stop would feel strange, almost unsafe. What began as a fleeting moment of terror has solidified into everyday life. Further down the road, you come upon a wooden fence wrapped in a curious pattern of knotted twine. At first glance, it looks decorative, but an older man leaning on a cane explains it to you in a whisper. Many decades ago, a series of wolf sightings sent panic through the town. The animals prowled near the outskirts at night, their howls stirring fear in the hearts of farmers. A superstition emerged almost overnight. Tying twine in a specific pattern on fences would confuse wolves and deter them. There was no proof. The fear flared brightly, then faded when the wolves moved on. But the twine remained. Even now, in a time when wolves haven't been seen in years, townsfolk diligently wrap their fences. They do it absent-mindedly, without questioning the origin. A fear that once lasted a single winter has become a generational habit, woven quietly into the town's landscape. You continue walking, the mist thickening around your feet. The soft glow of lanterns paints pale circles on the ground, and you feel as though you are drifting through a world where emotions leave permanent marks. Soon you reach a crossroads marked by a crooked wooden pole. At its top are several carved symbols, nothing frightening, but strange enough to draw your eye. A cluster of dots, a spiral, a crescent shape. These, a passing merchant tells you, were carved during a time of uncertainty when travelers brought stories of witches haunting distant forests. For a brief moment, the town panicked. A single council meeting produced a quick, improvised measure. Carve protective symbols at the crossroads so malevolent spirits couldn't follow people home. The symbols were meant only for the season of fear, just until people calmed down. But the carvings stayed, and over time they were copied, refined, and recarved anew. They became part of the town's identity, etched into wood, stone, and the corners of houses. What once was an anxious response now lives on as tradition, unquestioned, unchallenged, simply accepted. You walk deeper into the town's heart, reaching a narrow alley that feels older than the rest. The stones beneath your feet are uneven, worn by centuries of passing feet. On the wall beside you is something surprising. A faint chalk mark, shaped like a small X, accompanied by a looping curve. A woman emerges from a doorway carrying a basket and pauses when she notices your interest. That mark, she says softly, was drawn by my grandmother and her grandmother before her. She explains that many years ago, someone in the town believed that evil spirits followed people home and hid beneath windowsills at night. A temporary custom arose: draw a chalk mark to distract them. The fear was destined to be short-lived, one of hundreds of tiny superstitions that flared up and burned out. But this one didn't burn out. It rooted itself in family memory. Each generation taught the next how to draw the mark. The original fear dissolved long ago, but the ritual endured, quietly performed, softly remembered. Your walk continues until you reach the small village pond, calm and mirror-like beneath the moon. The surface barely moves, except for the occasional ripple from a drifting leaf. On the shore stands a wooden post with a rule carved into it. No one shall gaze into the water after moonrise. This catches your attention. The wording feels eerie, almost poetic. Yet its origin, you soon learn, was nothing more than a fleeting fear. Long ago, during a particularly foggy season, several children slipped by the pond at night and frightened their parents. Rumors spread that spirits lived beneath the surface, waiting for those who stared too long. The fear lasted only a few nights, but the warning on the post was carved during the height of the panic. And because carving something into would take effort and leaves a visible reminder, the rule outlived the fear itself. Children still avoid the pond at night, despite never knowing why. As you move through the misty scenery, you begin to sense that medieval life wasn't governed solely by lords or councils or laws written on parchment. It was shaped just as deeply by emotion, moments of collective fear that crystallized into customs. A single night of wolves howling, a single week of sickness, a single rumor whispered in the dark. These were enough to change behavior for generations. Fear, you realize, is sticky. It does not evaporate swiftly. It settles into corners, into carvings, into rituals. And once it becomes habit, it wears the mask of normalcy. You make your way back toward the town square, listening to your own footsteps echo softly in the quiet night. Torches burn lower now, and the world feels suspended in a gentle stillness. You pass one last house before the street widens, and above the door hangs a simple woven charm made of straw. Its shape resembles a tiny ladder, a temporary charm created during a single season of bad luck. A charm that somehow became a permanent emblem of protection. A relic of a momentary fear that refused to fade away. You pause a moment, letting the charm sway gently in the breeze. And you realize that medieval people lived in a delicate balance between uncertainty and habit. To survive, they sometimes grabbed hold of rituals born in fear. And once they held on, they rarely let go. The night deepens further, wrapping the town in a soft, comforting darkness. You step forward, ready to continue into the next quiet chamber of this journey, where fleeting superstitions evolve into lasting beliefs. You step out of the mist-thickened alley and drift toward the quieter edge of the medieval town, where the houses thin out and fields stretch into the night. A soft wind stirs the grass, carrying a faint scent of soil and something sweeter, perhaps wild thyme crushed under a wandering boot. As you walk, you begin to feel another subtle thread woven into medieval life, one that grew from fear and curiosity but somehow matured into accepted truth. Temporary superstitions, the kind that should have lived briefly, just long enough for a rumor to fade, but instead clung to everyday thinking with stubborn persistence. And here, out among the fields and scattered cottages, you can see those seeds of superstition sprouting into full-grown doctrine. It starts with a tiny clay figure sitting on a fence post. At first, it looks like a child's toy, roughly shaped, lopsided, with little dot eyes poked by a thumb. But a farmer tending to his sheep tells you it isn't for play. Many decades ago, during a single unusually stormy season, lightning struck 3 houses in the span of 2 weeks. Terrified, the villagers shaped these crude figurines to confuse storm spirits, believing the spirits would strike the figurine instead of a roof. A strange idea born quickly in panic. The storms passed, but the figurines stayed. In fact, the superstition grew so influential that parents now teach their children to make one every spring, just in case the weather turns sour. Historians still argue whether the practice came from pagan roots or if it was merely improvisation during a frightening month. But regardless of its origin, the superstition hardened into tradition. You pick up one of the figurines, feeling the clay, cool, grainy, and surprisingly comforting in your hand, and set it back gently where it belongs. As you continue through the fields, your foot brushes against something metallic. You look down to find a rusting iron nail driven into the base of a tree. You assume at first it's just scrap metal left behind from a repair, but a woman carrying a basket of turnip smiles knowingly. The nail was hammered into the tree to trap a wandering illness. One villager, generations ago, insisted that sickness could be pinned in place so it wouldn't enter the home. An odd idea, built from desperation. Yet the nail was never removed. Now, nearly every tree along the footpath bears a similar mark. Nails, wooden pegs, sometimes even bits of woven rope tied around trunks. What should have been a one-night remedy became a permanent belief, passed down as if it were ancient wisdom. You chuckle softly, remembering how earlier in the night certain herbs clung to doorframes long after their purpose faded. Medieval life, you're realizing, was full of these little leftovers, half-believed ideas that never quite died off. A few steps later, you approach a narrow garden patch. Cabbages grow neatly in rows, and beside them lies a line of smooth stones painted with faint symbols. They're delicate, almost whimsical swirls, triangles, dots. The gardener tells you that once, during a bad harvest, someone painted symbols to coax the soil into being kinder. No one expected it to work, and it probably didn't, at least not in any agricultural sense. But the stones became part of proper planting. Even now, farmers who don't believe in the symbols still place them out of habit because not doing so feels wrong. Like skipping the last step of a recipe even when you know it's unnecessary. It's one of those small decisions that became doctrine simply through repetition. One mainstream fact often noted in medieval farming records is that households sometimes stuck to ritual even when practical knowledge improved. And while today you understand crop rotation or soil nutrients, back then a swirl-painted stone felt just as valid as any scientific explanation. The air cools further as the night stretches onward. You cross a gentle rise overlooking the town, and in the distance you see lantern lights flickering like fireflies. Here, on the hillside, you notice wooden stakes hanging with small bells, barely audible until the breeze brushes them. At first you assume they're for decoration or perhaps to keep wildlife away, but an older shepherd sits nearby and explains in a low voice. Long ago, a passing traveler swore he'd seen wandering spirits at dusk. For one night only, the town panicked. People hammered stakes into hillsides and hung bells so the spirits would be startled and retreat. The panic ended when the traveler admitted he had probably just been tired. But the bells stayed, and eventually people claimed they offered protection not only from spirits but from misfortune, and later from bad dreams. Yes, bad dreams, as if these tiny charms could soothe the subconscious. You listen to the bell's faint chime and admit, at least inwardly, that they do feel calming. Maybe that's why the superstition endured. Not through fear, but through comfort. A fringe idea that settled into normal life simply because it made people feel safer. You continue walking until you reach a cottage. Smoke trails lazily from its chimney, and beneath the window hangs something familiar. A woven charm of straw shaped like a ladder. You've seen one already tonight, but here its story grows clearer. It wasn't originally a protection charm. A single family once hung it as a temporary gesture to represent climbing out of hardship during a difficult year. A symbolic decoration meant to last a week, maybe two. But visitors misinterpreted it as a spiritual ladder, an invitation for good spirits to enter the home. The misunderstanding spread quickly. Soon, everyone wanted a straw ladder of their own. And before long, it became a doctrine so ingrained that not hanging one felt unlucky. Historians still debate whether the original meaning was misunderstood or whether the charm tied into deeper European folklore that was never properly recorded. But either way, the ladder remains on every home now, unchanged, repeated through generations. You step inside the cottage, invited by the family with a warm nod. Inside, the walls are lined with tiny circular marks burned into the wood. Not symbols, but small scorch patterns. You run your fingers over them, feeling the faint indentations. Someone once believed that drawing a hot coal in a circular motion near the door could keep misfortune away for a single night. The coal was meant to be used once and discarded, but the scars it left became permanent. Generations later, families still burn small circles into door frames, not knowing why, only knowing it's what you do. What should have been a temporary ritual, invented during an anxious evening, has become an unbreakable tradition. And like all such traditions, it survives not because people question it, but because they don't. You leave the cottage and continue walking, feeling the night settle more thickly around you. Somewhere behind you, bells chime faintly. Ahead, the path grows darker, and you sense the next layer of medieval belief rising like fog on the horizon. The way fleeting solutions in courts hardened into justice that endured for centuries. But that's a journey for another step. For now, you let the night move quietly around you, filled with echoes of ideas that were never meant to last, but somehow did. You drift away from the quiet cottages and follow a narrow dirt path leading toward the outer edge of the medieval settlement. The air feels different here, cooler, sharper, carrying the faint clank of distant metal. A low rumble settles in the earth beneath your feet, and for a moment you mistake it for thunder before realizing it's something else entirely. The echo of drills, practice marches, and makeshift weapons being tested in the dark. This is the outer ward where villagers, most of them farmers by day, train to defend themselves. And the moment you step into the clearing, you feel it. The long shadow of temporary military fixes that should have lasted weeks at most, but ended up shaping decades of strategy. You move closer to a group of men standing around what looks like a wooden cart, except its front is covered with planks arranged into a crude sloped wall. A man with broad shoulders pats it proudly. He explains that during a brief border skirmish generations ago, the town lacked proper shields. So someone had the idea to tip a cart sideways and push it forward as protection while advancing. A desperation tactic, patchwork solution, but it worked well enough that people copied the idea. The skirmish ended, but the angled cart shield didn't disappear. Instead, it became a training standard, rebuilt, reinforced, refined. Now young men push these cart shields during weekly drills, convinced it's an ancient strategy blessed by time. Historians still argue whether this invention was a local idea or borrowed from a forgotten siege technique used elsewhere in Europe. Either way, the improvised tactic transformed into something permanent, simply because it had worked once during a frightening afternoon. You walk farther into the yard and see wooden stakes driven into the soil in neat rows. They look almost ceremonial, but a soldier waves you over and explains their origin. Long ago, during a single season when mercenaries were rumored to be wandering nearby, villagers planted sharpened stakes around the perimeter of the town as a temporary deterrent. They didn't expect an attack. The stakes were mostly for reassurance. The mercenaries never came, but the stakes remained. Now the townsfolk replace them yearly, as though it's a sacred duty. What was once improvised defense has become official doctrine. And you can see why, walking the perimeter, you feel the psychological comfort they offer. Even if the real threat has long vanished, the memory of fear lingers in the wood, as though embedded in the grain itself. A short distance away, you hear a series of metallic clangs. You follow the sound and discover a blacksmith standing over a row of helmets. Each one has a strange ridge hammered awkwardly along the top. The blacksmith tells you that during a sudden attack many decades ago, an attack that lasted less than 2 days, a soldier claimed that striking the helmet's crown at a certain angle reduced damage. No one knew if it was true, but during the panic they copied the idea, adding crude ridges for reinforcement. The ridge was meant to be temporary, a hasty attempt to feel safer. But now it's tradition. Every helmet crafted in town carries the same distinctive ridge, even though ironworking techniques have improved and the original reason has been forgotten. You run your fingers along the ridge. It feels rough, uneven, not particularly strong. But its significance lies in its story, not its strength. Moving past the helmets, you reach a small lineup of men holding wooden poles. At first you think they're practicing with spears, but as you approach, you notice the poles are capped with clay jars. A younger soldier explains, somewhat embarrassed, that long ago the town once lacked proper spearheads, so they affixed clay jars filled with sand to the ends of poles to add weight during drills. It was supposed to be a 1-week workaround, but the jars became tradition. Now, even though the town has proper weapons, new recruits still train first with these weighted poles to build discipline. One of the older men laughs and admits that half the time, recruits simply break the jars and try not to look guilty. You add a mental note. Medieval military innovation sometimes comes down to we made do and then we just kept doing. As you continue through the yard, you notice something more peculiar. A little wooden tower barely high enough to stand on. On top, a torch flickers beside a bucket of water. A young guard stands beside it, wiping his nose on his sleeve. He tells you that the tower was hastily built during a single night of panic when someone thought they saw enemy torches in the distance. The tower wasn't meant to last, but villagers began using it for weekly fire watch drills. Eventually, it became a semi-official part of local defense strategy. Even though the original enemy torches turned out to be nothing more than traveling monks with lanterns. The temporary lookout platform became doctrine simply because no one had a good reason to dismantle it. Off to the side, you find a circle of stones arranged around a patch of flattened grass, marked by char lines. It looks like an old ritual fire pit, but a soldier explains that it was once used to test an improvised signal fire method created during a tense season when communication with a nearby town was uncertain. The fire signals were meant to last only until a messenger returned safely. But people liked having them, so the method stayed. Through time, it evolved into a formalized system: 1 torch for danger, 2 for travelers, 3 for summoning help. None of these meanings are original, of course. They were invented haphazardly later, added to fill the silent gaps left behind by the original emergency. And as you watch a pair of soldiers rehearse the torch signals, you realize how quickly a temporary solution can harden into a rule. It doesn't take centuries. Sometimes it only takes a night. You move toward the far end of the training field, where an older veteran sits sharpening a blade. He tells you something that lingers with you. Sometimes temporary fixes lasted because people didn't want to admit they didn't need them anymore. To abandon a tactic meant accepting that the fear was gone, and fear, however uncomfortable, gave a sense of purpose. One quirky tidbit he shares makes you grin. During a brief conflict, soldiers once rubbed garlic on their boots, thinking the smell would repel enemy dogs. Didn't, but the habit stuck around for so long that people eventually claimed it softened the leather. You're not sure it does, but it's charming to imagine an entire militia smelling like a kitchen garden. As you step back from the yard, the lights of the settlement flicker warmly in the distance. You realize that in medieval life, improvisation wasn't just a response, it was a foundation. A desperate idea that helped for a week could, under the right mix of fear and familiarity, become a cornerstone of military identity. Ahead, the night deepens into a softer blue, guiding you toward the next layer of permanence built from the temporary. The tools that were meant to be disposable, yet refused to die. The morning air inside Rome had a softness to it, a kind of pale gentleness that made the city seem half-dreaming. A thin veil of fog drifted between the columns, brushing against the cobblestones as though the world was whispering to itself. It was the sort of mist that made torchlight wobble and blur, that made footsteps echo in strange, doubled ways, and for a fleeting moment, the city looked peaceful, almost sacred, almost untouched. But beneath that quiet softness, the city was not peaceful at all. It was holding its breath. The conspirators had agreed. This would be the day, the 15th of March, the Ides, a date that meant nothing to most Romans except a point on the calendar. Yet to these men it had become a blade, a deadline, promise. Behind shuttered windows and half-closed doors, they had whispered final words to their wives, some with trembling hands and others with unnerving steadiness. A few had slept almost not at all. Others had slept deeply, as though resolve itself had soothed them. But when dawn crept in, cold and pale, every one of them felt the weight of what was coming. Not a decision anymore, but a destiny rolling toward them like a boulder they had no choice but to stand in front of. The fog made the air taste faintly of metal. Somewhere on the Palatine, a rooster crowed, thin and lonely. The sound drifted over rooftops and faded into the city's stone canyons. It was answered not by other roosters, but by distant murmurs. Shopkeepers unbolting their doors, early workers trudging out into the dim streets, a cartwheel groaning as it turned. But one house remained still, the house of Gaius Julius Caesar, general, dictator, beloved hero to many, feared by others, and the man whose fate had been murmured in every shadow for weeks, was waking slowly. Servants moved with careful steps, their sandals brushing softly against the floor. Curtains were tied back. Lamps were snuffed. Water bowls were set out for washing. The ordinary rhythm of a Roman household beginning its day. Yet today, nothing about this home felt ordinary. Inside his chamber, Caesar himself sat at the edge of his bed, elbows resting on his knees, chin lowered slightly as if he were listening for something. He had slept badly. Images from Calpurnia's dream still clung to his mind like cobwebs. She had begged him not to go to the Senate. Her voice still echoed faintly, trembling, frightened, unlike the calm, dignified woman she usually was. He had seen her cry only a handful of times in all their years together. But last night, tears had streaked down her face as she described statues bleeding, the house collapsing, his own image falling. He tried to reassure her, of course. He had spoken gently, with reason, and yet her fear had not eased. And truth be told, though he would never admit it aloud, something inside him had felt uneasy. Now, seated alone while the early fog curled against the window, Caesar rubbed his forehead slowly. He was not a superstitious man, but he was not foolish either. He knew how many enemies he had. He knew how deeply ambition carved through Rome's political class. He knew that power was something both desired and despised. Still, he was Caesar. He had crossed the Rubicon. He had walked among storms and survived. Surely the Senate House was not the place where he would fall. Surely not there, in the very heart of the Republic he had fought to stabilize. He rose and dipped his hands into the cool water bowl. The shock of the cold ran up his arms, clearing his mind. Servants moved about him with quiet efficiency, but they sensed his mood and kept their eyes low, their steps quieter than usual. Calpurnia entered, her face still pale, though she tried to hide her worry. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Neither spoke at first. The silence between them felt fragile. Finally, she whispered, "Do not go today." Her voice cracked just slightly, enough that Caesar stopped fastening his cloak. He turned to her. For a long moment he simply looked at her, seeing the fear she was trying so carefully to keep contained. He touched her hand gently, then kissed her forehead. "Your concerns are heard," he said softly, "and I will consider them." It was not a promise. She knew it, and the dread in her eyes deepened. Outside, the fog thickened as though the entire city were trying to hide itself. Meanwhile, across Rome, in homes far less grand, another group of men was preparing, but for entirely different reasons. Brutus stood in front of a small bronze mirror, fastening his toga with movements that were steady but strangely slow. His reflection showed a man calm on the surface, but tense underneath. A man who had convinced himself he was doing what was right, yet could not silence the pulse beating sharply in his throat. He closed his eyes. For the Republic, he reminded himself. For liberty. For the Rome that must outlive kings. Yet another voice whispered back, quieter, crueler, and for your own legacy, for the story you cannot bear to watch being rewritten by someone else. His jaw tightened. Cassius, in another part of the city, tied his sandals with brisk, almost impatient movements. His mind was sharp, slicing through thoughts quickly. He felt fear, yes, but also a strange excitement, like a man who had waited too long for something he believed he deserved. Others dressed in hurried silence. Trebonius, Decimus, Casca, Cinna. Some with hands that trembled. Some with hands that did not. They all felt the same fog. They all felt Rome holding its breath. They all felt the weight of the hours shrinking around them. The agreed-upon signals. The daggers hidden beneath their togas. The plan to surround Caesar. The belief or illusion that they were restoring the Republic. One by one, they stepped into the street, swallowed by the dim, drifting mist. Above them, the sun tried to break through but could not. Not yet. Its light remained trapped in the fog, turning everything a blurred gold, as if the day itself were uncertain. As Caesar finally prepared to step outside his home, a faint tremor of hesitation touched him, brief, barely noticeable, but real. A whisper inside, soft as wind. Not today. He paused at the threshold. Behind him, Calpurnia watched, hands clasped tightly. Ahead of him, the fog parted slightly, as though inviting him forward. A messenger arrived suddenly, Decimus, urging Caesar to come, telling him the Senate awaited, implying that delaying would look weak, irresponsible, king-like, a dangerous image. And Caesar, ever aware of appearances, of politics, of legacy, exhaled slowly. He made his decision. The city's breath tightened, the fog drifted, and Caesar stepped forward, not knowing that every footfall was carrying him quietly, steadily, toward the final chapter of his life. The narrow streets of Rome seemed to hold their breath as Caesar moved toward the Senate house. The usual clatter of carts and chatter of merchants had faded into an eerie quiet, as if the city itself sensed the tension thickening in the air like a gathering storm. You can almost feel the weight of history pressing down here, as though every stone underfoot carries the echo of whispered conspiracies and veiled threats. Caesar's procession was small and deliberate. Servants and guards flanked him, but his eyes were fixed ahead, steady, even as his mind churned with unease. The warnings had not ceased. Messages carried in haste from friends, fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures, the restless silence of the Senate corridors. Yet he pressed on, compelled by duty, pride, and perhaps a stubborn defiance that had carried him through countless battles. You can imagine the sensation as he stepped into the Senate chamber. Sunlight filtering through high windows, dust motes dancing lazily in the beams, the marble cold beneath his feet. Senators gathered, their faces a mixture of respect, suspicion, and calculation. Some masked their intentions with thin smiles. Others betrayed anxiety beneath their finely woven togas. The tension was palpable. You might picture the flicker of torchlight reflecting off bronze daggers concealed beneath folds of cloth, the faint rustle of breath held too long, the subtle shifting of weight as men prepared to strike. The conspirators had chosen their moment carefully, the day when Caesar's power was at its height, yet when trust was at its lowest ebb. The opening words were spoken with practiced formality, but you sensed the crack beneath the veneer. As Caesar took his seat, the meeting began. A senator approached, a motion passed, and suddenly, like a silent signal, the attack erupted. You can almost hear the sudden sharp intake of breath, the scrape of sandals against stone as hands moved swiftly, the metallic glint of blades catching flickering light. The air thickened with shock and betrayal, and then the chaos. Caesar turned, once, twice, his eyes wide with surprise, then pain. You might imagine the sharp, unexpected sting as the first dagger found its mark, the chorus of voices shouting accusations and curses mingling in the confined space. His trusted friend, Brutus, was among the assailants. You can almost feel the collision of loyalty and treachery, the crushing weight of disbelief in Caesar's final moments. But it's also important to remember that even in such a violent scene, the details remain shrouded in debate. Historians still argue about how many times Caesar was struck, whether he spoke a final phrase, those famous words that echo through time, or if the moment was too chaotic for clarity. Some claim he whispered, "Et tu, brute?" a haunting betrayal immortalized in art and literature. Others suggest his last words were silent, the shock too overwhelming to allow speech. Whatever the truth, the assassination marked a turning point. The republic he had fought to shape now trembled on the brink of collapse. And yet, despite the sudden violence, you realize something subtle. This moment, though brutal and decisive, was also the product of years of tension, fear, and hesitation. A political system strained by ambition, by the slow erosion of trust, by temporary measures that had hardened into permanent resentments. The consequences rippled outward, transforming Rome in ways no one could have fully predicted. As Caesar fell, the city reeled, caught between the old order and an uncertain future. You might picture the aftermath. The corridors emptied, the shocked faces of senators, the hurried whispers spreading through the forum like wildfire. Rome was no longer the same city that had greeted Caesar that morning. The fog that had seemed to soften the day's edges now thickened into a shroud of uncertainty. And in the hearts of its people, fear took root, not just of immediate violence, but of the fragile future they faced. You can imagine the paradox. The men who struck to save the Republic may have instead hastened its transformation into empire. Their temporary act of violence laid the foundation for a new political order, a permanent shift that shaped centuries to come. It's one of history's great ironies. What began as a desperate attempt to hold onto an ideal became the catalyst for irreversible change. You might also reflect on how this event, though violent and public, is remembered through layers of interpretation. How art, literature, and legend have shaped our view of it. The real moment, of course, was more complex, murky, and human than any dramatization. And yet, it remains a vivid symbol, a reminder that the temporary decisions, fears, and actions of individuals can echo through history far beyond their original intent. As you step away from the imagined Senate chamber, the night air of Rome seems to pulse with that very legacy. The city moves forward, shaped forever by a day when fear, ambition, and fate intertwined. The echoes of that fateful day in the Senate had barely faded when the city of Rome plunged into chaos. You can almost see the streets, narrow, winding, often crowded, now filled with murmurs, hurried whispers, and faces shadowed by fear and uncertainty. The air was thick with tension, like a storm about to break, and every citizen felt it, whether they understood the politics or not. The assassination was not merely an isolated act of violence. It was a spark in a powder keg of distrust, ambition, and unrest. The Republic's fragile fabric, stretched thin over years of civil strife and political maneuvering, began to unravel. You, as an observer walking through the aftermath, would notice how quickly temporary alliances shifted into permanent enmities, how fear bred suspicion, and how rumors spread like wildfire through the forum and marketplaces. Immediately after Caesar's death, Rome teetered on the edge. Power vacuums formed, and each faction scrambled to assert dominance. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal ally, seized the moment with a fiery speech that stirred the crowd, turning grief into outrage. You might imagine the scene. Antony standing over Caesar's open coffin, holding up the stained toga, speaking words that transformed the public mood from shock to fury. It was a masterful performance that changed the course of events. This moment exemplifies how fleeting circumstances can harden into new realities. The violence, though sudden, catalyzed years of civil war. Temporary political expedients morphed into permanent divides. You walk through the city and overhear debates that no longer seem like disputes, but deep-seated conflicts destined to shape generations. In the days and weeks that followed, Caesar's assassins fled Rome, their intentions misunderstood or forgotten. The people who once celebrated them began to fear retribution and chaos. You might imagine the city's streets filled with soldiers and armed citizens, their faces tense, hands on weapons, waiting for the next wave of conflict. Despite the turmoil, some tried to hold onto the hope that the Republic might be saved, that the Senate's authority could be restored. Yet historians still argue whether such a restoration was ever truly possible. The political and social currents had shifted too far. Temporary solutions, like the assassination, could no longer fix permanent problems. Amid this unrest, a figure rose who would come to define Rome's future. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. You imagine him arriving quietly at first, a young man unassuming but determined. Octavian used his inheritance not just of wealth, but of political influence and Caesar's name as a foundation. He forged alliances, played factions against each other, and gradually built power. This process was not smooth. You can picture the long, tense years of civil wars, betrayals, and battles that reshaped Rome's landscape. Each skirmish was a chapter in a saga born from a single moment of violence that was supposed to restore the old order but ended up dismantling it. Temporary alliances hardened into rivalries, temporary rules into permanent ones. Rome was transforming. You might find it curious how often the idea of temporary resurfaces in this era. Temporary truces, temporary power-sharing agreements, temporary governments. All meant to bridge moments of crisis but lasting far longer than intended. These fragile pacts often contained the seeds of their own undoing. In the midst of this political turmoil, daily life in Rome carried on, though under a cloud of uncertainty. You imagine markets where vendors speak in hushed tones, families gathering behind closed doors, children sensing the tension but not understanding its cause. One quirky detail that historians note is how rumors and superstition intertwined with politics during this chaotic time. For instance, many Romans believed that Caesar's spirit haunted the city after his death, appearing in dreams or shadows, warning of the upheaval to come. Some even claimed to see omens in the sky, comets, eclipses, or strange lights. Whether these were true or imagined, they fueled the sense that the city was caught in a supernatural reckoning. This intertwining of the supernatural and political isn't unique to Rome, of course. Many cultures throughout history have reacted to turmoil by weaving fear and belief together, creating rituals and stories to explain the unexplainable. In Rome's case, these beliefs helped solidify political narratives, making the assassination and its aftermath feel like destiny rather than chance. As you imagine the city's slow transformation, you notice the architectural changes as well. The grand temples and forums, symbols of the Republic's glory, began to feel overshadowed by new buildings and monuments, symbols of a new era. Temporary memorials built in the heat of grief and celebration became permanent fixtures. Statues of Caesar and later emperors stood where once only senators had gathered. This physical layering of history is a reminder that temporary events, born in moments of fear or ambition, can leave lasting marks on the landscape, just as they leave marks on the minds of people. You continue your walk through the city, feeling the weight of this transition. The republic that once seemed eternal now feels fragile, almost like a fading dream. The streets, the voices, the very air seem charged with the memory of violence and the promise of empire. You pause near the forum and imagine the crowds, some hopeful, some fearful, all aware that history is being rewritten beneath their feet. The tension between what was lost and what is yet to come hangs heavy. And you sense that this tension, this moment of uncertainty, is itself a story of things once thought temporary. Assassinations meant to restore order, alliances meant to be brief, power meant to be shared, that instead reshaped a civilization. The city's heartbeat continues, slower now but steady. Rome, the eternal city, was entering a new chapter. As the dust of Rome's civil unrest settled, you find yourself wandering beyond the city's stone walls, where the pulse of empire beats differently, slower, yet no less determined. The empire's reach was growing, stretching into distant provinces, each new territory marked not just by conquest, but by the steady imposition of Roman order. Yet this expansion was built on legacies of temporary measures that became permanent realities. You imagine the legions, rows of disciplined soldiers, their armor shining faintly in the early morning sun. They march forward, not just as instruments of war but as agents of transformation. The temporary forts they built to secure borders turned into towns. The camps that once served as short-term shelters became permanent settlements, growing roots deep in foreign soil. The Roman road network, originally constructed to move troops swiftly in times of crisis, became the veins of empire, stitching together diverse cultures and economies. What was intended as a temporary military convenience became the backbone of trade, communication, and governance for centuries. You sense the irony that many of these infrastructure projects began as urgent responses to threats or rebellion, hastily planned and executed with short-term goals. Yet they endured long after their creators imagined, shaping the very identity of the empire. One vivid example comes from a fort on the Rhine frontier. You picture a rough wooden palisade, hastily erected to defend against Germanic tribes during a sudden incursion. The soldiers stationed there expected to move on after the threat passed, but decades later, that fort had evolved into a bustling town, with markets, temples, and families. What was temporary military necessity morphed into cultural permanence. This phenomenon wasn't limited to structures. The Roman legal system, too, evolved from pragmatic solutions to complex problems. Temporary decrees and emergency laws issued during times of crisis gradually became codified statutes. What began as quick fixes to stabilize chaotic situations became the foundation of legal traditions that survive in various forms today. You stroll through the shadowed ruins of a forum, imagining senators debating laws that were once provisional but grew into centuries-old customs. It's a reminder that law, like architecture, can be shaped by the urgency of a moment but outlast the moment's context. The story of temporary turning permanent plays out vividly in religion as well. The empire, once fiercely polytheistic and diverse in worship, gradually embraced Christianity, a faith that had been persecuted and marginalized. You envision early Christian communities, small and secretive, holding gatherings in catacombs, viewed as temporary refuges from persecution. Yet these hidden meetings laid the groundwork for a faith that would not just survive but eventually become the empire's official religion. The temporary status of Christianity in Rome transformed into a permanent pillar of Western civilization. The process was neither smooth nor inevitable. You sensed the tension between old beliefs and new, between fleeting tolerance and firm establishment. Historians still debate how much political expediency versus genuine conviction drove this monumental shift. In the midst of these broad transformations, everyday life was equally shaped by temporary adaptations turned permanent fixtures. Consider the Roman aqueducts, massive feats of engineering initially designed to meet the immediate needs of growing cities. They were built quickly, with urgency, to supply clean water and support urban life. Yet these aqueducts, some stretching for miles, became symbols of Rome's greatness and ingenuity. What was once an emergency infrastructure project became a lasting legacy that influenced urban planning for millennia. You reflect on how the people who lived alongside these aqueducts likely took them for granted, unaware of their origin as rapid solutions to pressing problems. Their permanence outpaced their original purpose. Similarly, the Roman calendar itself offers an example. The Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar, was a reform meant to fix inconsistencies and confusion in the old system, a practical, temporary measure to stabilize timekeeping. But its effects were profound and enduring, shaping how we mark days, months, and years even now. You pause to consider how many aspects of life that seem natural and inevitable were, in fact, born from temporary fixes. This speaks to a larger truth. Societies are constantly improvising, adapting, and inventing, often without realizing that their stopgap solutions will become the fabric of future generations. The empire's rise was not just a story of conquest but of adaptation and transformation. Temporary military outposts turned into cities, emergency laws into legal traditions, persecuted religions into dominant faiths. The lessons are clear: what is meant to be temporary can, under the right circumstances, become permanent. You find yourself walking alongside a quiet river, imagining the layers of history beneath the water's surface. Just as the river reshapes the land slowly but inexorably, so too do the temporary decisions of individuals and societies shape history in ways no one can predict. It's a reminder that the past is not static but fluid, a continuum where moments of crisis, fear, and necessity create ripples that expand across time. As the sun begins to set, painting the sky with soft oranges and purples, you sense a quiet wisdom in this understanding, that history is not just the story of kings and battles, but of countless small choices, many made in haste or fear, that outlasted their makers. And as night falls over the empire, you feel the weight of those choices settling gently, like a final breath before sleep. You step away from the grand cities and sprawling empires, journeying into the quieter, darker corners of medieval Europe, where life unfolded with a harsher rhythm, one shaped by seasons, superstition, and survival. Here, temporary fixes were often born out of sheer necessity, but like echoes in a deep cavern, they lingered far longer than anyone expected. Imagine a small village nestled in a misty valley, surrounded by thick forests where shadows dance and mysterious sounds weave through the trees at night. The villagers wake each day to chores that rarely change: tending fields, caring for animals, repairing the fragile structures that shield them from cold and storm. In this place, temporary often meant, for as long as we can manage, and temporary solutions sometimes became permanent fixtures simply because there was no better option. One example you might notice is the common medieval bridge. Originally, these were often makeshift constructions, logs laid across streams, stones piled hastily to create crossings. They were meant to last only through a season or two, until a more permanent solution could be built. But permanent bridges were expensive and difficult. Timber rotted, floods washed away stones, and the community's resources were limited. So those simple, rickety bridges remained in use, repaired bit by bit, until generations later they became familiar landmarks. Unstable, maybe, but deeply woven into the village's daily life. You might cross such a bridge, heart racing as you balance carefully on the uneven planks, aware that what you walk on was never intended to endure for decades. It's a small but vivid reminder of how necessity often overrides durability. Beyond bridges, you hear stories of buildings cobbled together with whatever was at hand. Wattle and daub walls patched repeatedly, thatched roofs mended season after season. These shelters were meant to be temporary refuges from the elements. Yet many stood for lifetimes, growing crooked and worn but stubbornly resisting decay. One curious detail you might find charming is how medieval people often reused materials. Old timbers, stones from ruined castles, scraps of cloth. They were repurposed endlessly. This was partly practical, partly cultural. Nothing was truly waste if it could be salvaged. The temporary was folded back into the permanent again and again. You might find yourself wondering how such a lifestyle affected people's sense of time and permanence. If your roof might leak again next winter, if the bridge you cross could collapse any day, how do you imagine the future? How do you plan beyond the next season? These questions linger in the air like the smoke from a village hearth, soft and persistent. At the heart of medieval life were customs and traditions, many born from urgent needs but becoming rigid social rules. Consider the temporary festivals that were originally celebrations for harvest or warding off disease, but that over centuries turned into elaborate rituals observed every year, no matter what. The medieval calendar itself was dotted with feast days and saints' days, some originally quick fixes for communal bonding or spiritual reassurance, later codified into unbreakable traditions. And while these customs provided structure, they also trapped communities in cycles of repetition. Historians still argue whether this rigidity helped preserve social order or hindered innovation. You might notice how superstition seeped into everyday life, often linked to the need for temporary protection. For example, during outbreaks of plague or famine, villagers might erect crosses made from hastily carved wood at crossroads, or hang charms above doorways. These were meant to be temporary safeguards, protection until the danger passed. Yet many of these charms and symbols became permanent fixtures, passed down through generations, even as their original meaning faded into legend. You imagine the power such objects held, not just as spiritual talismans, but as anchors of identity and hope in a world so uncertain. The line between practical solution and superstition was blurred, creating a landscape where faith and fear coexisted. The same can be said of medieval fortifications. Early watchtowers built in response to raids were meant as temporary outposts, quickly erected to provide warning. But as threats persisted, these towers became permanent, evolving into castles and fortified towns. You can almost see how a hastily thrown-up wooden tower gradually gave way to stone walls and battlements, each layer a response to shifting threats and ambitions. One unusual fact you might find surprising is that many castles began as simple earthworks, mounds and ditches that were initially quick defenses. These temporary fortifications became symbols of power and permanence, deeply entwined with feudal identity. Meanwhile, you sense the weight of change pressing on the villagers' lives. The temporary scarcity of food or the temporary labor of serfs tied to the land became lifelong conditions, creating social structures that lasted centuries. What started as responses to crisis hardened into societal norms. Walking through a medieval village at dusk, you might overhear whispered stories about old remedies or protective charms, shared from one generation to the next. These tales, born from desperate times, became part of the cultural fabric, proof that even the most fleeting ideas can endure. This enduring legacy of temporary solutions teaches you something essential about medieval life. Survival depended on adaptability, but also on accepting the permanence of uncertainty. You end your day beneath a starry sky, the village quiet except for the crackling of hearth fires and the distant hoot of an owl. The world feels both fragile and resilient, shaped by countless small decisions that were never meant to last but did. And as you close your eyes, you carry with you the lesson that history is often made not by grand designs, but by the persistence of what was supposed to be temporary. You find yourself drifting into the dim, flickering light of medieval monasteries, those quiet sanctuaries of knowledge and faith, perched on hillsides or tucked away in valleys. The monastery's walls are thick, built to last, but many of the practices inside began as temporary expedients, evolving over centuries into enduring institutions that shaped European history. Imagine monks cloaked in simple robes, moving through stone cloisters with slow, deliberate steps. Their days are punctuated by prayer, study, and labor, a rhythm intended to balance the spiritual and the practical. But this way of life, so familiar to us in stories and history books, was once a set of improvisations, responses to crises that seemed temporary. Monastic communities originally formed as refuges for those fleeing the turmoil of the outside world. Wars, invasions, political chaos. At first, many of these settlements were makeshift, hastily gathered groups living in wooden huts or caves. They sought safety and spiritual solace, not permanence. But permanence came. You might picture the abbey's first wooden chapels replaced by grand stone cathedrals over centuries, their walls echoing with chants and footsteps. What began as fragile retreats transformed into powerful centers of influence, both religious and economic. One fascinating aspect of these monasteries is how they became hubs for preserving knowledge. In a time when books were rare and literacy limited, monks copied manuscripts painstakingly by hand, often working by candlelight deep into the night. The libraries they built were not just collections but fortresses against the eroding tides of ignorance. This preservation was born out of necessity, a temporary measure to safeguard texts from war and neglect. Yet their work laid the foundation for the Renaissance and the modern era. Without these monastic efforts, much classical knowledge might have been lost. You might be surprised to learn that many of the techniques used in medieval manuscript illumination, the beautiful, intricate artwork decorating the pages, were originally practical embellishments meant to aid memory or highlight important passages. Over time, these decorations became an art form, valued for beauty as much as function. In these cloistered halls, daily life followed strict schedules, governed by rules that balanced prayer, work, and study. The Rule of Saint Benedict, one of the most influential monastic codes, was initially designed as a guide to structure community life during times of hardship. Its emphasis on obedience, humility, and labor was practical advice meant to maintain order during uncertain times. Yet this rule became the backbone of Western monasticism, influencing countless communities beyond the initial temporary circumstances. The monasteries also became centers of agriculture and innovation. You might imagine the monks cultivating lands once considered wild or unproductive, introducing new farming techniques, and managing estates that fed thousands. Their gardens supplied medicinal herbs, which were sometimes the only source of healthcare for miles around. These practical, often temporary solutions to survival and health gradually turned into established systems of knowledge and economy. Interestingly, the monastic communities were not isolated from the world's politics and power struggles. Over time, they amassed wealth and influence, sometimes rivaling secular lords. Their initial purpose as humble spiritual refuges shifted, and some abbots wielded significant political clout. This tension between spiritual ideals and worldly power remains a subject of scholarly debate. Did these institutions drift from their original purposes, or was their evolution a necessary adaptation? You wander the monastery grounds and notice how many buildings show signs of multiple phases of construction. Wood replaced by stone, small chapels expanded into grand halls. These layers tell a story of temporary fixes becoming permanent fixtures, each generation adding to what came before. Monasteries often offered sanctuary to travelers and pilgrims, a tradition that began as a temporary kindness extended to weary souls, but became a formalized aspect of their role. This hospitality not only served spiritual purposes, but also facilitated trade and communication across regions. You might be fascinated by how some of these monastic networks functioned almost like medieval postal systems, relaying messages and goods through a chain of abbeys and priories, a system born from necessity that shaped medieval communication. Outside the walls, the influence of monasteries reached into local villages. They provided education to children, cared for the sick, and offered charity to the poor. These services were often temporary responses to crises like famine or plague, but became institutionalized roles. Imagine the quiet strength of these communities, often overlooked in grand histories, yet vital to the social fabric of medieval Europe. In the quiet evening light, you sit beside a small chapel window, watching shadows lengthen over ancient stones. You realize that the medieval world, with all its seeming harshness and instability, was full of examples where temporary solutions outlived their creators, shaping history in unexpected ways. This slow transformation, from fragile beginnings to enduring institutions, is a testament to human resilience and adaptability. As night falls and the chanting fades into silence, you feel the deep connection between past and present, knowing that many things we take for granted today once began as hopeful, uncertain attempts to meet immediate needs. As your journey through medieval history draws near its end, you find yourself standing at the crossroads of past and future, where fleeting moments, urgent fixes, and fragile hopes solidify into the foundations of what will last centuries. The medieval world was a place of constant flux, but paradoxically, many things intended as temporary measures ended up shaping life for generations. You might consider the humble peasant's hut, built quickly from timber and thatch, designed to shelter a family through harsh winters. These structures, patched and rebuilt season after season, became enduring homes. Over time, simple dwellings clustered into villages, villages grew into towns, and towns blossomed into cities. What began as fragile shelters turned into the bedrock of European civilization. The same could be said for the roads and paths winding between settlements, originally tracks carved out by travelers, herders, or traders seeking the easiest way. Though never planned as permanent highways, they formed the skeleton of Europe's medieval transport network, guiding commerce and communication. Even now, many modern roads trace the routes first forged by these temporary trails. In the marketplaces, temporary stalls, set up for festivals or seasonal trade, became permanent fixtures, evolving into the grand market halls and trading centers that fueled medieval economies. These spaces, born of necessity, fostered a sense of community and exchange that shaped urban life. But beyond physical structures, the medieval world's temporary nature is most striking in its social fabric. Serfdom, for instance, began as a response to labor shortages and economic pressures following the collapse of Roman administration. It was meant as a provisional system to bind workers to the land during chaotic times. Yet it hardened into a rigid social order that persisted for centuries, shaping lives and limiting freedoms. You sense the deep contradiction here, temporary solutions transforming into permanent institutions that defined people's identities and opportunities. Medicine and healing offer another example. When plague or injury struck, desperate remedies were often improvised: herbs, prayers, rituals. What started as experimental or localized practices sometimes became codified into medical traditions, passed from healer to healer, eventually forming the basis of medieval medicine. Despite its limitations, this system endured long after its founders had passed. Historians still debate how much medieval medicine truly advanced, or whether it mostly clung to superstition. But its persistence shows how temporary knowledge, born of trial and error, can become the norm. You also think about education during this era. Many early schools grew out of church efforts to teach clergy, starting as small, informal gatherings. What began as temporary instruction soon expanded into universities, permanent institutions dedicated to learning, debate, and scholarship. These universities would go on to influence the Renaissance and beyond, rooted in medieval beginnings that no one initially expected to last. And then there are the traditions, the festivals, the stories, the songs. Many arose as seasonal or regional customs, temporary celebrations of harvests, saints, or victories. Yet over centuries, they embedded themselves deeply into cultural identities. Some you might still recognize today, surviving in altered forms but carrying echoes of medieval life. You imagine the joy and relief these festivities brought. A chance to break from hardship, to connect, to remember. In a world full of uncertainty, they offered a thread of continuity, however fleeting. One quirky but telling example is the practice of chivalry, a noisy, sometimes chaotic village ritual involving banging pots and singing, originally meant to shame or mock individuals who disrupted social norms. Though initially a temporary, spontaneous event, it became a ritualized tradition in many communities. You realize that these customs, like physical structures, show how the boundary between temporary and permanent is often blurred. As you reflect on the medieval world, you understand that its character was shaped by necessity and improvisation. People built, adapted, and lived in conditions where the temporary was often the only option. Yet through resilience, repetition, and sometimes sheer stubbornness, these temporary things, buildings, laws, customs, and beliefs, became the permanent threads in the fabric of history. And as you stand on the threshold of today's world, you might find comfort in this truth. Many of the systems and structures we consider fixed and immutable were once tentative, fragile attempts to meet immediate needs. History, you realize, is a constant negotiation between the fleeting and the enduring, between the urgent and the lasting. And as you prepare to rest, you carry with you the knowledge that the past's temporary shadows continue to shape the light of the present. The long journey through medieval history, with all its twists and turns, reveals a world that was never as stable or as permanent as it might seem at first glance. The people who lived then were often responding to crises, improvising solutions, and building fragile structures in a landscape of uncertainty. Yet, these responses, meant to be temporary, grew roots deep in the soil of time. Imagine the quiet persistence of a village path worn smooth by countless footsteps, or the weathered stone of a castle keep that began as a hastily built defense. Picture the festivals that lighted up dark winters, born from brief celebrations but cherished for generations. These are the echoes of the past reaching into today. As you close your eyes, you might feel the rhythm of centuries, the ebb and flow of empires, the rise and fall of ideas, the fragile balance between change and continuity. It is a soothing reminder that history is not a series of grand events alone, but the accumulation of countless small moments and choices. Rest with the knowledge that the world you inhabit carries the legacy of those temporary things made permanent, and that your own life is part of this endless story of adaptation and endurance. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let the gentle shadows of history ease you into sleep.